Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. We're all at sea this week, though we do have a course plotted, and with any luck we should avoid disaster, unlike several of the pioneering navigators featured in David Barrie's book Sextant, a celebration of the men who risked their lives to map the world's oceans, and unlike the unlucky occupants of the luxury yacht that provides the setting for the Icelandic author Yrsa Sigurðardóttir's latest thriller, The Silence of the Sea. Also with us this morning, the writer Rose George, who signed up as a supernumerary on one of Danish line Mærsk's giant container ships to research her book on the invisible industry, shipping, which is indispensable to almost every part of our lives. We start, though, with Mærsk's predecessors, in a way, traders whose routes stretched across the known world from Newfoundland to the Black Sea, and who provide the subject for the British Museum's new exhibition, The Vikings. Michael Wood, you immersed yourself in this exhibition because you're going to act as a guide on the cinema relay, which will allow people to visit the exhibition if they can't get to London. The word Viking itself, it's an activity, isn't it? It's an occupation. They take their name, this society, from the act of going out.
There's a lot of argument about this, actually, Tom. But yes, the best explanation is we're going to go Viking. We're going to go off on an expedition.
So it's a verb as well as a noun.
Yes, and actually you get it used of the northern invaders in the 9th century. I mean, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle does actually refer to an army of Vikings in the Anglo-Saxon. So pretty early this seems to have stuck to them.
Would they have ever called themselves Vikings? To what degree was it a self-consciously unified society?
There's no self-conscious unification to it, but there's definitely a self-consciousness to the society. When you look at the descriptions of them from other cultures, even Arab sources, because what you've got to remember is this time was an amazingly expansive time. They go to Greenland, they go to Iceland, of course, Greenland, Newfoundland. They probably sailed down to Manhattan for all we know. The other way, they went to the Caspian, Baghdad, the rivers down through Russia, and all of it. There's a sort of swaggering self-confidence to them. Arab and Persian writers refer to their kind of tattoos and their long hair and their personal bathing habits and their swagger. These are kind of Johnny Depp almost. I would hesitate to say. But
it's a very intense, rather short-lived period, given the impact it had on the world. 800 to 1050.
Yeah.
Not long in terms. I mean, it's not an empire, but it's not long in terms of, as it were, cultural impact on the world, is it?
Well, not long, but in European history, a couple of hundred years is a long time in dynastic politics, and I think it begins before 800. You've definitely got attacks in the 750s in southeast of England, and I suspect that war was a condition of the times, and that kind of raiding went on all the way through from the fall of the Roman Empire. It's just that there's a surge of energy and people out of Scandinavia that contemporaries seem to have seen represented something different. And they're a catalyst for a huge changes in European society. Just to take the British Isles, I think the kingdoms of Britain, the little kingdoms of the Scots, the Welsh, and Anglo-Saxon England, which eventually becomes England, they wouldn't have happened were it not for a response to this threat.
Now, it's quite nuanced, the exhibition, isn't it? Part of its point is to say you can't think of them only as raiders. That the name might mean that might be what comes through the historical record, because it's obviously the most vivid encounters with them. But in a lot of cases, they're coming and they're trading, or they're settling.
Yeah, the monks wrote the histories, and they lost a lot of treasure, books, lives, everything else. But yes, there used to be. I remember there was an exhibition in 1980 in London, the last great one, and there was a big stress on them as traders, and kind of peaceable exchanges, origami, all that sort of stuff. I mean, I think it's right to let's get back to what it's all about.
So you don't entirely buy that.
This exhibition's got fabulous weaponry. The kind of bling of the weapons is almost as great as the bling of the necklaces and all that stuff. But yes, great traders. You go to Viking York or Viking Dublin. You visit a Viking king, he's got kind of Persian carpets in his hall and French wine. The wife of the king has got studded furniture and wears Byzantine silk. They wheel a deal, they trade. The extraordinary hoard from Harrogate that's on display here for the first time in the exhibition has got coins from Baghdad and Persia.
This was fascinating to me. The dirham became a kind of currency in the Scandinavian lands, and they both used it as coinage and as jewellery. And that seems to be interchangeable. There's a lot of jewellery here which is partly dismantled, because essentially if you were on your uppers, you could just uncoil a bit of your talk, chop it off, and then it becomes currency again.
Chop a bit off, stick it back in your bag. If you're going to leave Skye on a great expedition, you bury it, which is why the archaeologists find it, But yes, movable wealth, treasure. You look at the poetry and it's all about kind of bravery and leaving a great name for yourself, courage in the face of adversity, really realistic stuff. But at the same time, it's about treasure, the kind of flame-licking golden decorations.
Clearly, if these societies were going to grow, they were going to have to go outwards. I mean, they had the forests and the mountains at their back, and they had the sea at their front. The sea was the way out. Does that do something to a society, that direct and intimate connection with the sea, do you think? Does it change it culturally deep down?
Well, I'm sure Yrsa can talk about that better than I can, but when you read the poetry, that sense of the sea as sunlit blue wave, a kind of benign medium. I'm carrying my poetry across the sea, Egil says, the great poet of the time. But at the same time, it's cruel, cold, and constant. There's a wonderful poem by Egil Skallagrimsson, the greatest of the Icelandic poets, about the loss of his son in a shipwreck. You feel that sense that the sea will always take away. Runs right the way through. But they were happy on land. They made great societies in the East Midlands and in York, and permanent societies.
Yrsa, they left their mark on Iceland, not least in the fact that I think Iceland is deforested partly because of Viking settlements. That's one theory anyway, that their desire for wood was so great that they basically cut them.
Yeah, I think also that the climate change, when they arrived, it was during a very warm period in sort of weather history in Iceland, but I think they also, because they let their sheep run wild, and it's hard enough to have a tree grow there that if you don't have animals trying to eat like the small leaves and things. So
that was settlement, as it were, not raiding.
That was settlement.
There was a permanent settlement.
So they arrived in. I think it said that the settlement begins at 874, but there had been some monks there before that sort of left when these people came. And I think less than 100 years later, it was full. 10,000, 20,000 people had arrived, and there was no more space for the good parts were all taken. So that's when settlement sort of is considered to finish.
And Iceland has preserved the as it were, the intangible treasure of the Norsemen, because you've preserved the literature, which you can't bury in a hole in the ground and hope to find.
Yeah, there's not much for like an archaeological dig in Iceland into this time. They might get a bead or it's really. But what we do have, and that's sort of our contribution to world history, that's the literature and the sagas and the manuscripts. We have no castles, we have nothing fancy, but we have this, and it's to us it's very, and I think to the world it's quite an impressive contribution, I think.
Well, it is. It's that intangible cultural notion of the sea and going to sea, isn't it? David Barrie, I wanted to bring you in because one of the interesting things about this exhibition is there's no, as far as I could see, no navigational instruments. I mean, this is your subject. Clearly, they were travelling along the coast much of the time, but they made big open water voyages as well, didn't they? Is there any notion as to how they did it?
Well, I think there are some good guesses about how they did it. And of course, the reason there's nothing in the exhibition is there are no material objects that have survived that we know of. Yes, they were coastal seafarers, but they were perfectly prepared to take quite risky passages, not over huge distances, at least not deliberately. So if you're going from Norway to Shetland, from Shetland to Faroe, from Faroe to Iceland, you're talking about 200 or 300 miles at a time, maybe 2-3 days of sailing.
Yes, I think there are differences of definition here. As a landlubber, I regard any voyage in which I'm out of sight of land as...
Well, the thing is, they wouldn't have been out of sight of land necessarily for very long periods, because these are high lands.
Yeah.
And they would certainly, I mean, all seafarers are adept at taking note of the behaviour of, for example, seabirds. There are certain birds that only travel 20 or 30 miles from land. So as soon as you see those birds, you know that land is nearby. And if you watch where they fly at the end of the day, returning to their roosts, that's the direction to follow. So they would have used cues of that kind. But there's quite an interesting debate. Michael may know about this, about whether they used something called Iceland spar, which is a mineral which has the capacity to change the polarization of light. These may have been things called sunstones, which would have helped them to keep track of the position of the sun and use that as a navigational cue. It's hotly debated, but there are some recent discoveries that suggest that may have happened.
Rose George, is there any kind of notion in Maersk of this long tradition? I went on their website. I thought they might have a longboat on there or something, but there's no sign of it at all. It's very kind of mercantile, you know.
I'm afraid I've never seen any reference to Vikings in Maersk. No, they're very, I mean, they're such a huge modern global company. I mean, no, I don't think
it's all disappeared. But it's terrifying. Your accounts of going to sea in a huge ship, but in the moment you hit storms, the notion that you would travel in open water in an open boat, essentially.
I've actually done 2 trips on container ships. The second one was on a Maersk ship, but I first went to sea on a container ship in 1999 on a Canadian ship across the Atlantic in midwinter with 22 Indians, which means I didn't eat curry for quite a while afterwards. But it also meant that, yes, you're in the middle of this magnificent ocean, but it's absolutely terrifying. And I was very, very pleased to be on a massive container ship. But I can't imagine being on they were open boats, weren't they? The Viking longboats.
Yeah.
So,
well, there is a marvellous example, isn't there, in the British Museum exhibition? Very cleverly revealed late. It's the late reveal of the show.
Yes. I mean, huge
the
size.
Roskilde ship.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, really big. I know,
it's astounding. I had no idea they built on that scale.
Yeah.
130, 140 foot.
40 feet, yeah.
Amazing.
70 rowing benches or whatever it is. You know, these are big scale boats. I mean, they probably had, they certainly had the ability to cover, to hook down skin covers for their cargoes and stuff like this. So, but if you knew that there was a big storm coming, if you could at all help it, you'd probably go for land.
Yes, but one shouldn't underestimate the ability of people back then to have a pretty shrewd idea what the weather was going to do, and during the summer there are typical weather patterns that they would have taken advantage of that would have enabled them to make voyages in particular directions.
Yeah, your book, I mean, has several famous voyages in open boats. I mean, you talk about the Bligh voyage, a very famous kind of feat of open water navigation, and then Ernest Shackleton escaping from the pole to South Georgia. Essentially, I mean, your book's called The Sextant. You've taken the instrument as the title for what is an account of the early attempt to map the oceans. There's a rather interesting catch-22, isn't it? You can only work out that your navigational system is working properly if you've got accurate maps, and you can only make an accurate map if your navigational system is working.
Exactly. There's this wonderful circularity, and I mean the point about the sextant is that it is absolutely at the heart of accurate navigation from the middle of the 18th century, when the longitude problem is finally solved. You can't fix your position out of sight of land without a sextant. And that remains substantially true until the electronic revolution, really the Second World War, and for small boats, right through really until the arrival of GPS in the 1990s. So when I was sailing across the Atlantic with this wonderful old naval officer, Colin McMullen, in 1973, there was no choice. We had to use a sextant.
Just for listeners who know nothing about it, give us a very simple beginner's guide. It's essentially a device for measuring the angle of a heavenly body.
Exactly.
From the horizon of the Earth.
Yes.
And that angle, when you look it up in maps and tables, will tell you roughly where you are.
Yes, I mean, the simplest thing is to determine how far north or south you are. And you can do that. I could show you how to do that in 2 minutes. You do that when the sun reaches the highest point in the sky at noon, local noon, and that height basically gives you your latitude. People knew about that. The Vikings probably knew about doing that with the stars, the pole star. It wasn't quite over the pole in those days, but they'd have had a pretty good idea how far north or south they'd gone by looking at the stars. For longitude, you need time.
So latitude is between the north and the south
exactly.
pole. Longitude is the
east
meridian that goes round.
And there are two solutions to that problem that emerge with astonishing simultaneity at the end of the 1750s. One is a clock, Harrison's famous chronometer,
which was written about in longitude.
Exactly. And the other is an absolutely beautiful method of celestial navigation, which involves measuring the distance, the angular distance between the moon and the sun. And that can give you your time too. But for both of those things, whether you're using a chronometer or lunar distances to get the time, you have to have a sextant.
Now, this is another naive question. I've always wondered, again, as a sort of landlubber, how on earth do you take an accurate reading of the horizon when you're in the middle of a small boat and it's rising in a swell of 12 feet up and down?
It's difficult. It's difficult. And
all right, it's not a simple matter then.
No, one of the things that's lovely about the sextant is that it's a skill, it's an art. You have to learn how to use it. You have to acquire the ability to judge whether the sites you've taken are reliable or not. And a really brilliant navigator like Frank Worsley, who navigated the James Caird across the Southern Ocean in the middle of the winter from Elephant Island to South Georgia. I mean, the most astonishing feat. I mean, he only gets about 3 or 4 shots of the sun in the course of this voyage, but he makes this perfect landfall. And one of the reasons is that he spent a lifetime taking sites with a sextant, and he just knows exactly which sites to rely on and which to discard.
You interweave into your book your own voyage across the Atlantic when you were a young man, learning to use the sextant.
Yes.
That's important. You have a kind of direct sense of what it was, the challenges some of the men you're writing about are taking on.
Exactly. I mean, the curious thing was, in 1973, when I did that with Colin McMullen, we had absolutely no sense that the era of celestial navigation was actually coming to an end, because satellite navigation was already there, and GPS, the most sophisticated modern version, was just starting to be developed. But it was a magical thing to learn, because there is something truly sublime about fixing your position in the middle of the ocean by reference to the sun and stars.
You give it an almost ethical quality, as opposed to GPS, which is detached and technological. I mean, you write it involves a deep immersion in the natural world, doing it this way.
It does. You're in touch with the cosmos, literally.
Natural navigation, isn't it?
It is it's natural navigation with a technological twist. But I think it's incredibly rewarding, and it breaks my heart, actually, that so many people now have turned their backs on it and are relying entirely on a little blue screen with a boat going across it, you know.
Your captain did have a sextant.
That's my captain's lament, yes. on my ship. The captain on my ship is a wonderful man who'd been at sea for 42 years, and he'd gone to maritime college in South Shields, and it taken him a year or so to learn navigation, but he said once he did, the penny dropped, and I think he fell in love with the sextant. And it became a bit of a theme when I was on board for 5 weeks, and I would spend a lot of time on the bridge. And I didn't do maths, and I'm not a sailor, and I was entranced by his kind of love for the sextant, but his lament was the officers who are now coming up. Doesn't really matter where they're from. Modern day seafaring officers can be from all over the world. But his lament was they just don't know how to use the sextant. They rely on screens. And you go on the bridge of a modern container ship or a modern ship, and it looks like a TV production place. It's a bank of screens, isn't it?
Well, it is in your novel as well, isn't it, Yrsa? There's just a set of computers.
It looks like an office.
Yeah, it looks like an office. But there is, on our ship, you opened a cupboard, and amongst all the binders of regulations and environmental regulations and all the mountains of paperwork that seafarers have to deal with, there was this box with the sextant in it, but the only person I ever saw take it out was the captain.
Yeah, one hopes there's a very good set of instructions with it, because very few people...
No, there isn't.
And the trouble is, you actually do have to practice. You get out of practice, and it's quite hard to do it again.
There's another element to this too, though, isn't there? Because if you're looking at a screen inside the bridge, you're not looking at the water. There's no possibility of using those natural signs on the surface of the water.
Yes.
Exactly.
He said that seafarers don't use their eyes anymore. They're so busy looking at screens, but you can learn such a lot from looking out of the window. I mean, there's a reason that even modern container ships have windscreen wipers, so that they can see out, and there are binoculars, and you have to watch the sea, and it's a skill to be able to see things in water, isn't it?
GPS, like a lot of modern technology, has this kind of distancing effect. And it's interesting, there's some wonderful work that's been done with the Inuit in northern Canada, and evidently the arrival of GPS in those communities has had the effect of really corroding the natural navigational skills of the people. I mean, the older generation apparently, amazingly, can find their way almost without ever getting lost, just using the natural cues, the shapes of the snowdrifts and the stars and the behaviour of the animals. The younger generation apparently can't do it anymore.
No, you don't know where you are. That's the irony,
yeah,
isn't it, with
exactly.
GPS? When you read the accounts of navigators who have access to no instruments at all, for instance, those accounts were written in the 60s and 70s of the Polynesian navigators across the Pacific, then what they're doing is they're closely observing the texture of the sea, the colour of the sea, the run of the sea, the change of the clouds, the taste of the sea. And the Vikings would be something like that. It's an orally transmitted knowledge, isn't it?
But
and all early navigators are the same.
Absolutely.
I think,
There is an earlier equivalent of this, there, isn't there? Because the first Europeans to go to the Pacific, they were able to find an island the first time round. They then fixed its position. They recorded on the map erratically and not very accurately. But then they couldn't find it again.
They couldn't. The thing is, until the middle of the 18th century, you couldn't fix the position of anything at sea. You could barely do it on land. It's astonishing to think that there were no accurate maps, even of dry land, until the 17th century. And at sea, not until the 18th century.
Well, I think there's some figure that 1813, the exact longitude of Rio de Janeiro, still isn't known.
Oh,
I mean, they're a hugely important port, I imagine.
1831.
Well, I can tell you an even more fabulous story than that. I got obsessed with French colonial islands in the sort of late 70s and 80s, and I remember going to the Hydrographic Institute in Paris and getting maps of not only the Indian Ocean ones, but the Polynesian ones. And there actually were three categories of small islands, tiny islands, one of which was location incertain. We're not sure where it is. One was location inconnue, and the other one was existence douteuse. We're not even sure that they exist. And these were on Hydrographic Institute maps from 1979.
Can I just say that the ones of doubtful existence have been the bane of hydrographers, because they've had to spend days or even weeks looking for them to prove that they didn't exist.
You want the world
Very
still
difficult
be
to do.
mysterious, you see.
Rose George, I want to turn to you, because you were essentially heading down the motorways of the sea. You were in the big shipping lanes, the kind of well-established shipping lanes, for your book, Deep Sea and Foreign Going, which is essentially about what you call an invisible industry. Why invisible? After all, we sort of know it exists, don't we?
Do we? I mean, I think if you stopped an average person on the street and asked them if they'd heard of the big shipping companies, Maersk, Evergreen, Hanjin, I don't think they're household names. And of course, there's a reason for that. It's a business-to-business industry. Its business is delivering stuff to us. But if you stop people on the street, in fact, this has been done by the Maritime Foundation, said, how much do you think of all your stuff around you comes to you by sea? Most people say 30%, 40%, no idea, and it's 90%. In the UK, it's 95%.
You describe yourself playing this game on trains and looking around you and
we
estimating.
Can do it now, if you like.
Well, we're going to come out at about 90%, aren't we?
Well, I can only guarantee that probably that water didn't come by sea, but probably pretty much everything else in the studio probably came by ship, and it's so we are as reliant on shipping and the sea as ever before. But I think, as a maritime nation, I think maritime culture has retreated from us in our sort of imagination and our consciousness far more than ever before. And I think, in a way, you can understand why, because now the ships are so big, because containerisation has made the shipping industry big. We've got these massive ships that are 4 football fields long.
They really are massive. You point out at one point that if they unloaded the containers of the ship that you travelled on, it would create a line of traffic 60 miles long.
Yes.
On a motorway.
Yes.
I mean, they're huge.
They're huge. I mean, if you just think that 1 or 2 boxes is one truck, so you can see that makes shipping very, very efficient, and that's why it's so that's why we rely on it so fundamentally. But on the other hand, it just makes these enormous ships, and now, of course, Maersk's Triple-E ship has now carries 18,000 containers, and it's just enormous. It's so big that not many ports can actually take it in. But I think the romance of the sea and the maritime world, I think, has now retreated to sort of yachters and leisure sailors, and there's this kind of disconnect between what the sea is used for, which is a place of industry, and I don't think that's in our consciousness anymore. We don't really meet any working seafarers anymore. The British seafarers are now fewer than 20,000, used to be 150,000. There aren't any British ships anymore, but we're absolutely dependent on ships.
But this is partly because of something you also write about a great deal, which is flagging out.
And flagging out is when you can choose to fly the flag of any country. It's like a brand or a tax. So you pay a fee. You fly the flag of Mongolia has a fleet. Inland Bolivia has a shipping fleet. Of course, Liberia, which is a very small country in Western Africa, has the second biggest fleet in the world. And Britain and the US and the old shipping nations, they have very small fleets on paper, but they have a lot of ships. They're just flagged out to.
Now the reason for flagging out is because
they're called flags of convenience because they're very convenient.
Just explain to people why they're convenient for the owners.
Well, it's a very competitive industry, so often a flag will offer lower taxes, no inconvenient labour laws or regulations. It's generally more convenient. You can employ who you like. You're not required to employ your own nationalities. So it's a lot freer
and cheaper. For the owners, essentially.
It's a free market. It's probably the freest of markets there is.
You describe, once you get out beyond territorial waters, you're essentially in a different zone of law, aren't you? You're in
I think
another world, the laws are there, but not always apply.
The laws are on paper, and Yrsa says this in her book, and is that are there any laws at sea? Yes, of course there are. There is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. On paper, the seas are tightly regulated, but if you're out at sea and you want to chuck somebody overboard, let's say, as happens in Yrsa's book, where are you going to go? Where's the police? Where on my ship, which was a nice ship, we didn't have easy internet access. We had dial-up email, we had satellite phones, but practically the distances at sea just make it, you're out in the middle of nowhere. And this comes to play in the Indian Ocean when piracy was really rife a few years ago. People would think, well, there are naval patrols now in the Indian Ocean, and there were quite maybe a dozen ships, and various independent countries had ships out there too. But in practice, they can't get to you, and they can't get to you for hours or days, and it takes 15 minutes for pirates to board a vessel. So that's why people say, well, why are there are all these military ships around, but why are so many ships getting hijacked? Because the Indian Ocean is vast. And at one point, the EU NAVFOR, one of the naval forces commander, said it's like having 2 police cars patrolling Western Europe, and they can travel at a speed of 15 miles an hour. So, and then people say, why can't we do more? So I don't think people understand the immensities of the ocean, because we generally now we fly over them.
Yes, you travelled through the pirate zone yourself, didn't you? Because you went from England to Singapore, so
yes,
you went through the Suez Canal.
Yes, I did, and my ship was considered just high enough to not be a risk to pirates, but it was still very, very unnerving. And once we got down the Suez Canal and started approaching the Gulf of Aden, suddenly the ship changed, and suddenly all the portholes were covered in cardboard. There were all the blinds.
This is so you sailed dark at night.
So we sailed dark. It was like the Blitz on a ship, but there were double watches. There was always 2 people on the bridge wings looking at all times. I didn't really understand that because there were containers everywhere you looked, so your visibility was limited anyway.
Were they armed?
No. At that point, hardly anyone carried armed guards. Now it's very common to carry armed guards, and there's debate about whether that has contained piracy, because it is now contained. But I think it's certainly. I mean, pirates are not stupid. They if they're fired at, they will retreat. It's a mercenary business. It's criminality, which is why when people talk about comedy pirates and see them as kind of Johnny Depp figures, well, they're criminal thugs, and they're very
holding
brutal.
Remarkable numbers of people hostage.
They were at one point. When I went to sea in 2010, I think about 550 seafarers were being held hostage, and yet their presence in the media and in the public consciousness was minimal. And at the same time, the Chilean miners who were trapped underground, there were 1,000 journalists at the mine entrance. And it was weird, the big disparity, and I just think the seafarers are you write
about the sea being a different place, being kind of out of the normal universe. And rather interestingly, I mean, you write about it without romance. You know, it's boring, it can be alienating on board, but at the same time, when you get to the end, you're reluctant to leave.
I am a bit romantic about it. There are times when you go out on deck, and I would go to the forecastle and I would just hang out there, and to be on deck at night in the middle of the ocean, it can't not be romantic. It's such a soothing, terrifying combination.
David Barrie,
no light pollution.
Well, that one of the things that is so sad about modern civilization is, we live in these huge cities which are bathed in light, and the result is we can't see the night sky. I mean, most people now live in cities where they can't actually see more than a handful of stars. And when you go out in the ocean, away from all of that, it is a truly astonishing spectacle, suddenly, again, to see the glory of the heavens.
But the appropriate word is sublime, isn't it? It is that curious mixture of awe and wonder, but dread is mixed in there, a sense of vulnerability.
And extreme smallness.
Exactly.
Yes, Sigurdardottir, I wondered whether if Iceland, it's not a ship, but it is an island and a small one, and you live on the coast, does that do something again to the culture of a country?
I think it does, yeah. And the sea for us has always been, it gives and it takes. So you get the fish, the sustenance to maintain inhabitation in Iceland. But it also, people die getting the fish out of the sea. And I think about 3 years ago was the first year in Iceland where no one was killed at sea. And it used to be in the 70s, because a lot has moved forward with respect to safety and also probably the GPS and things, that in the fishing towns you would hardly have a class in which somebody hadn't lost their father to the sea. And this was in the 70s. So we've come a long way with respect to safety and I guess people are not as because of this, it's not as much in the media, the danger and so on, but it does define a nation for sure. And all of the inhabited areas in Iceland are along the coast. Nobody lives inside the sort of the highlands in the middle of the country.
So essentially you have darkness on both sides if you...
Yeah, we do, yeah.
Which is that experience of being mid-ocean in a sense.
So, and also like darkness is... There's a city darkness, and then there is this on sea or somewhere totally remote darkness, and it's just two different things.
You're writing about a different kind of darkness in your book, The Silence of the Sea, your sort of human darkness, really. Rather brilliant idea to set it on a boat. Almost anything can happen. Nobody's going to come and rescue you. Yeah, you're a long way from...
It was supposed to be sort of a modern-day take on stories like the one on the Mary Celeste, where you have a ship coming full sail. Nothing seems to be wrong, but everybody has disappeared. So this yacht comes sailing into the harbour. Nothing is wrong, but everybody's disappeared on the yacht. And it's sort of
a couple
a story
of people have
about
come to meet it, and they think everything is normal until it rams the dock.
Yes,
and
nobody's on board. So it's a sort of but it has a bonus that the Mary Celeste tale doesn't. That you will get to know what happened in the end.
It's also got a curious quality, which is it's the Mary Celeste, but there's something else. There's a sort of Nordic sense of haunting and the supernatural to it. I mean, I don't want to give anything away about your plot, but certainly there's that sense as you're reading the early pages that there might be more here than, as it were, simple human agency. Is that something particularly that goes deep in the Icelandic imagination?
It does. I think even though sort of belief in elves and ghosts and things, it's going down quite rapidly in the country. My grandmother would tell me not to throw rocks because it might hit the invisible people that were sort of what you would call elves. But I wouldn't say this to my children. So this is sort of, it's dropping.
So it's fading away.
It's fading, and unfortunately, because it's nice. But there is a higher belief, I think, in sort of ghosts and palm reading and this type of thing in Iceland than you would have in most Western countries, I think.
And is that because of the isolation of the country or because of a cultural inheritance from the Vikings?
It could be, probably both. We've never been a very religious people. And as an example, when Iceland took over Catholicism, became Catholic in the year 1000, they made an exception that the bishops and the priests in Iceland, they were allowed not to marry, but they could have a woman, because it was just considered ridiculous that that someone would want to be celibate. And so we have, and if you look at also the Norse religion, there you have Freyja, there you sort of celebrate this aspect of humanity, which is breeding and so on. So I think we never really...
It's long been a much more egalitarian society than many other European countries, hasn't it, in terms of gender relationships? Yeah. It's slightly odd, isn't it? Because I mean, part of the originating history of Iceland is abduction. I mean, there is...
Yeah, but both men and... They abducted, both slaves of male and female. And the reason... One of the things that during the settlement... They were sort of the Vikings or the Norse people that went to Iceland. They were fleeing taxes, a lot of them, because Harald the Fairhair, I think he's called in English, he had sort of the first ruler who sort of took over complete Norway, and he was starting to ask people to pay tax, and they found this unfair and left. But their women didn't really want to go with them, probably because they didn't have a sextant, They didn't know where they were going to end up, so they... This is how we're told happened. That they dropped by Scotland and Ireland and they stole women because they were so beautiful. They took them with them, and that's why the men in Iceland are I think their genetic DNA or the DNA is 90% from Norway, but the women only 50%. 50% come from the Celtic women, and I think the reason that women have been historically in Iceland sort of a lot. In a better situation, I guess, than elsewhere, is that life was hard. There was no opportunity for a woman to be a delicate flower or a butterfly or what. She had to, people had to participate. Everybody had to
work together.
Yeah.
But that hardship plays part in your book as well, because it involves the financial crash. The reason this luxury yacht is being repatriated to Iceland is because the loan has gone bad, the bank wants it back. All of that is very important as a different kind of catastrophe, isn't it?
It is, yes. It was one that took us very much by surprise, I would say, because it all happened so quickly. This money came, or these banks were privatized, I don't know, not even 10 years before they went bankrupt, if I remember correctly. So it was a bit bizarre that there was all of a sudden all of these, not all of these, there were not that many people, but very, very rich young people who worked for the banks or were investors. And because typically in Iceland it was the dentist that was the richest person, or the guy who owned the drugstore. These were the two occupations if you wanted to be affluent in a way, and the difference between this rich dentist and the normal person would be that he would be able to go take his family to Spain once in the summer, whereas you'd have to wait every fifth year.
In fact, when researching this novel, you couldn't find a luxury yacht left in Iceland.
I couldn't. So I had to go on a Fishing trawler, yeah. and sort of try to imagine.
How was the accommodation on the fishing trawler?
Well, it was funny. They had, because it was an old one, and they had sort of put in a sauna. No, not a sauna, a jacuzzi. And to get into the jacuzzi, because it was there's not a lot of ceiling height, you had to sort of, go flat in and into the...
Yeah.
It was...
we had aspirational leisure facilities on our ship as well. We had a basketball hoop, which was right on the poop deck, so I don't know where the balls were supposed to go into the ocean. But
Did anybody ever use it?
I never saw it being used. There was also a barbecue set right in front of the bank of refrigerated containers, which were humming constantly, and it wasn't particularly... But, they were making an effort.
The Vikings certainly did barbecues, and they certainly did a lot of sport. They leisure time, they definitely liked to do throwing, running, jumping, wrestling, games, fighting. So it's not changed entirely.
One of the things I was thinking about when we were talking about the size of the Viking ships is that when they came to Iceland, they had to bring all of the livestock because the only mammal native to Iceland is a fox. So I've often wondered, what is it like to be on one of these boats with a horse or two or three?
What's it like being a horse?
Yeah, or being a horse, yeah. Oh my God.
Well, the voyages of exploration, I mean, the vessels were 100 foot long, and they were packed with livestock in addition to large crews.
It's livestock ships feature in your book too, don't they?
Yes,
and are still pretty unpleasant. And
yes, well, if you work in the livestock industry, then you probably tolerate them. But there are people who think they're very unpleasant. I write about a ship that was a livestock carrier that sank off Tripoli and in Lebanon, sorry, not in Libya, and it was horrific. There were 10,000 or so, 15,000 or so animals drowning in the sea. The crew, half the crew died. It was a really sort of apocalyptic scene, and this was in 2009, the week before Christmas, 13 miles from shore and from civilization. So I think the sea is still such a dangerous place. I think we can't sanitise, and it will never be sanitised.
No, well, and also we think 12 miles is the immediate kind of border, isn't it? And then 200 miles beyond. But even 12 miles offshore, you're in a very dangerous place.
You're in the wildest place. Well, you set foot off. You leave land. You're on the wildest place on the planet.
Okay, well, thank you. We'll leave it there. That's the best summation, I think. Thank you to all of my guests. Yrsa Sigurðardóttir's The Silence of the Sea and David Barrie's book on the sextant are both out now. Rose George's Deep Sea and Foreign Going was published last year. The British Museum's exhibition Vikings Life and Legend opens later this week until mid-June, and Michael Wood will be presenting a guided tour of the exhibition for cinema goers on April the 24th called Vikings Live. Next week, is it possible to negotiate peace after centuries of violence? Rather topical subject that, I imagine. I'll be talking to Andrew Hussey, Gabrielle Rifkind and Ziauddin Sadar. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free. Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. We're all at sea this week, though we do have a course plotted, and with any luck we should avoid disaster, unlike several of the pioneering navigators featured in David Barrie's book Sextant, a celebration of the men who risked their lives to map the world's oceans, and unlike the unlucky occupants of the luxury yacht that provides the setting for the Icelandic author Yrsa Sigurðardóttir's latest thriller, The Silence of the Sea. Also with us this morning, the writer Rose George, who signed up as a supernumerary on one of Danish line Maersk's giant container ships to research her book on the invisible industry, shipping, which is indispensable to almost every part of our lives. We start, though, with Maersk's predecessors, in a way, traders whose routes stretched across the known world from Newfoundland to the Black Sea, and who provide the subject for the British Museum's new exhibition, The Vikings. Michael Wood, you immersed yourself in this exhibition because you're going to act as a guide on the cinema relay, which will allow people to visit the exhibition if they can't get to London. The word Viking itself, it's an activity, isn't it? It's an occupation. They take their name, this society, from the act of going out.
There are a lot of argument about this, actually, Tom. But yes, the best explanation is we're going to go Viking. We're going to go off on an expedition.
So it's a verb as well as a noun.
Yes, and actually you get it used of the northern invaders in the 9th century. I mean, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle does actually refer to an army of Vikings in the Anglo-Saxon. So pretty early this seems to have stuck to them.
Would they have ever called themselves Vikings? To what degree was it a self-consciously unified society?
There's no self-conscious unification to it, but there's definitely a self-consciousness to the society. When you look at the descriptions of them in other... I think it begins before 800. You know, you've definitely got attacks in the 750s in southeast of England, and I suspect that war was a condition of the times, and that kind of raiding went on all the way through from the fall of the Roman Empire. It's just that suddenly there's a surge of energy and people out of Scandinavia that contemporaries seem to have seen represented something different, and they're a catalyst for a huge changes in European society. Just to take the British Isles, I think the kingdoms of Britain, you know, the little kingdoms of the Scots, the Welsh, and Anglo-Saxon England, which eventually becomes England, they wouldn't have happened were it not for a response to this threat.
Now, it's quite nuanced, the exhibition, isn't it? Part of its point is to say you can't think of them only as raiders. You know, that the name might mean that might be what comes through the historical record, because it's obviously the most vivid encounters with them. But in a lot of cases, they're coming and they're trading, or they're settling.
Yeah, the monks wrote the histories, and they lost a lot of treasure, books, lives, everything else. But yes, there used to be. I remember there was an exhibition in 1980 in London, the last great one, and there was a big stress on them as traders, and you know, kind of peaceable exchanges, origami, you know, all that sort of stuff. I mean, I think it's right to let's get back to what it's all about.
So you don't entirely buy that.
You know, this exhibition's got fabulous weaponry. You know, the kind of bling of the weapons is almost as great as the bling of the necklaces and all that stuff. But yes, great traders. You know, you go to Viking York or Viking Dublin, you visit a Viking king. He's got kind of Persian carpets in his hall and French wine. The wife of the king has got studded furniture and wears Byzantine silk. They wheel a deal. They trade. The extraordinary hoard from Harrogate that's on display here. Other cultures, you know, even Arab sources, because what you've got to remember is this time was an amazingly expansive time. They go to Greenland, they go to Iceland, of course, Greenland, Newfoundland. They probably sail down to Manhattan for all we know. The other way, they went to the Caspian, you know, Baghdad, the rivers down through Russia, and all of it. There's a sort of swaggering self-confidence to them. Arab and Persian writers refer to their kind of tattoos and their long hair and their personal bathing habits and their swagger. These are kind of you know, Johnny Depp almost. I would hesitate to say. But
it's a very intense, rather short-lived period, given the impact it had on the world. 800 to 1050.
Yeah.
Not long in terms. I mean, it's not an empire, but it's not long in terms of, as it were, cultural impact on the world, is it?
Well, not long, but in European history, a couple of hundred years is a long time in dynastic politics, you know, and